Greetings collectors and welcome to today's retro game review. It's not often that a home edition of a game ends up as the superior addition to the arcade, but that's exactly what happened with today's game of Atomic Runner for the Sega Mega Drive. Sadly, Atomic Runner holds a rather dark origin story that is seldom told, but an important one all the same. A game that rose from an era of communism and one of mankind's most devastating nuclear accidents. Atomic Runner started life in the arcades back in 1988 and released under the name Atomic Runner Chelnov Nuclear Man the Fighter. In Japan, the game was also released under the title Chernobyl. For those of you that know your history of man-made disasters, you can start to see why this game was so controversial at the time, and perhaps explains the lack of a European arcade release. Officially, only jammer boards for the Japanese and North American regions were released. Back in 1980s Europe, we were deep into the Cold War. Capitalism versus communism, East versus West. The region had been at odds ideologically since the end of World War II. At the end of the war, many cities in Western Europe and the Allied forces had been largely crippled by the Axis bombing runs. Germany had been divided into East and West regions, and the rise of the Soviet Union began as it annexed several neighbouring countries such as the Baltic states, Ukraine and many more. There was an uneasy peace during this time. By the early 80s, Western Europe was getting back on its feet, but Eastern Europe struggled under the arguably unsustainable methods of the communist Soviet state. Little did we know, just around the corner, Europe would become the stage for events that shape our region and wider world to this day. In 1986, catastrophic events caused by a flaw in the core of the Chernobyl nuclear reactor would go down as one of the worst nuclear incidents of all time. At the time, the town of Pripyat was part of the Ukrainian Soviet Socialist Republic. The flaw in the reactor made the nuclear reactor become unstable. Before we knew it, real-life horrors were spilling out across the region as fire devastated the Chernobyl facility and radiation poured out into the surrounding area. Allegedly, in the early stages of the disaster, the Soviet propaganda machine began to deny the extent of the events.
The flashes on this film are caused by radioactivity. By Saturday evening, radiation levels in Pripyat were intense. But it was not until 12 hours later that the bewildered population were finally told what had happened.
Внимание, внимание! Уважаемые товарищи, в связи с аварией на Чернобыльской атомной электростанции в городе Припяти складывается неблагоприятная радиационная обстановка. Сегодня, 27 апреля, начиная с 14:00 часов, возникает необходимость провести временную эвакуацию жителей города в близлежащие населенные пункты Киевской области.
However, a disaster on a scale this large couldn't be hushed up. The full extent of the tragedy would be played out for years to come. Exclusion zones over 100 kilometers were put in place. Dozens of civilians died in the coming days, with thousands more dead over the following years, and hundreds more hospitalized for long periods after. With little in the way to stop the radiation sickness, iodine solutions were some of the only limited treatments after the fallout. To this day, it has never been quantified of the true loss of life associated with the event. We do know though that numbers affected are likely to run into the thousands or even tens of thousands of people. All told, the Chernobyl disaster caused unforetold ecological damage, with reports of mutated animals due to the increased radiation levels, as well as an ongoing legacy to this day. The radiation did not discriminate by its victims, and remains one of the worst European disasters of all time. For many of the first brave attenders at the scene combating the leak, this was a one-way trip.
началось сооружение 136-метрового тоннеля к основанию 4-го.
So, let's make a game based on this, someone thought over at Data East. Simply one of the most mind-blowing decisions ever, and still a decision that looms over Data East to this day. The game came to us in the form of Chelnov in North America and Cherunobu in Japan. In the arcade editions, you control a Soviet Union coal miner called Chelnov who has been caught in a nuclear disaster and gains his powers as a result of the accident. The Japanese name of the game, Cherunobu, seems to directly reference the nuclear disaster of Chernobyl. To balance the argument here, Data East responded in a television program that the name Chelnov of the main character was merely a relative of Karnov, Karnov being one of their leading game mascots of the day. However, throw in the Soviet hammer and sickle, the direct naming translation, and the fact that the nuclear disaster happened just 2 years prior to the game's release, it's fair to say that they knew what they were doing. The evidence was damning enough. Now, Chelnov might easily have been forgotten. After all, just look at the long list of 80s arcade games, and it's quite likely that once the initial controversy was over, the game would just fade away into history. That would have been the case if it were not for Sega. You see, Sega needed great content for the Sega Mega Drive and Genesis, and despite its rather tasteless premise, there's no denying that Chelnov was a great game. In 1992, we saw Sega release a somewhat modified Chelnov on the Sega 16-bit consoles, and it was a superb conversion. The game surpassed the original in several ways. So how was it that Sega turned living memory's worst man-made disaster into a 16-bit masterpiece? Firstly, the game would now simply be called Atomic Runner. However, the decision to keep the main protagonist's name of Chelnov survived. Next, that Soviet imagery, gone. It's important to remember that in 1986, at the time of the Chernobyl disaster, and 1988, the year of the arcade release, the Soviet Union was still very much a thing, although not for much longer.
Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall.
By 1989, Europe was at the brink of change. On the 9th of November 1989, the Berlin Wall dividing East and West Germany fell, creating the reunified country of Germany that we know and love today. By 1991, the Cold War was almost completely over and the Soviet Union had collapsed. If you live in Europe, you'll remember just what a significance the year 1991 had for us all. Former republics, annexed by the Soviet Union's expansion, had begun to declare independence. The Baltic states of Estonia, Latvia and Lithuania had declared independence by September 1991. By the end of 1991, Belarus, Uzbekistan, Kazakhstan, Georgia, Azerbaijan, Moldova, Kyrgyzstan, Tajikistan, Armenia, Turkmenistan and of course Ukraine, site of the Chernobyl disaster, had declared their own independence. The Soviet regime desperately tried to keep control, but no one was listening.
The Ukrainian drive for world recognition appears to be picking up steam, and it seems Soviet President Mikhail Gorbachev can't do anything to stop it. Today, he warned leaders in the republics of disaster if the country collapses. But at least in Ukraine, not many were listening. Don Murray has more.
This afternoon, less than 2 days after the independence referendum, Ukrainian Foreign Minister Anatoly Zelenko signed documents establishing Ukraine's first formal diplomatic ties with Hungary. The mood of celebration was evident, not least because of the rapid recognition of Ukrainian independence by Canada, the first of the 7 leading industrial powers to do so.
The Soviet era had ended. This is at least partially what made the 1992 release of Atomic Runner acceptable. With the Soviet Union gone, the Atomic Runner game had at least a bit of a fresh start to bury its old backstory. It's clear that Sega went to extreme lengths to distance any reference to either the Soviet era or the Chernobyl disaster. The old storyline now ripped up in favour of something more family friendly. The Mega Drive edition now contains a long exposition setting up the backstory. Chelnov is now a scientist living and working alongside his father in a harmonious and happy life. One day, Chelnov returns to his house after a huge explosion is heard, to find his father dying. His father proceeds to fill in some of the missing detail. Wait for it. Yes, it's aliens. The Deatharians, who claim to be the original inhabitants of Earth, who were here before the dawn of man, are back and want to claim what's rightfully theirs. Chelnov's father claims to have known about this for years, which is the reason he and his son have been working on science projects for so many years. Chelnov's father then proceeds to give him a suit that will increase the strength of a normal man to superhuman levels. Implanted within the suit are various weapons and devices. Plot twist number 2, the Deatharians have also taken your sister, so you have to suit up to rescue her and destroy the aliens. Plot twist number 3, before you even end the exposition, your father dies and you are captured by the Deatharians. The story explains how you're captured, tortured, and the aliens also attempt to brainwash you. At the last minute, you break free and go on a rampage against the hostile invaders. So yeah, that escalated quickly. From we're having a nice time in the garden to actually no, we're being attacked by aliens that were here since the dawn of time, your sister's been kidnapped, your father's now dead, quick, here's a futuristic killing suit, by the way, you're now being brainwashed and tortured by aliens. Say what you want about the changes Sega made, I'm all in for this new backstory. It's clear that the main menu has also been changed, with an emphasis on the suit rather than the accident. So, now with an interesting backstory, the 16-bit Sega edition had won the moral high ground to recreate the game. We were all used to seeing decent conversions of arcade games on the Sega 16-bit consoles, but Atomic Runner went the extra mile. The backgrounds are now more detailed, as are the sprites themselves. The music is at least on par with the arcade version, and the control systems have been given an overhaul. Atomic Runner is no ordinary run and gun affair. For starters, you can't stop running. That's right, you can move forward, stand still and jump, but can never walk to the left except for when fighting the level bosses. You are reliant on the never-ending scrolling screen to catch up with you. This is a fantastic game mechanic. It's an unusual experience to start with, but I came to really enjoy it after a while. As you run along, you'll be shooting down the enemy, some on the ground, others flying at you. You can either shoot them or jump on them, it's up to you to use your best judgment. Of course, you will also need to pick up power-ups. These typically either increase the range of your shot or the power. Both are vital if you are to survive the stage, and they are lost if you die. Thankfully, they are fairly abundant though, so you should be able to pick up where you left off in most cases. The third pickup is a change of weapon. There's a decent variety of laser shot, fire wheels, boomerangs, and even a wide area metallic ball shot. It's very satisfying to experiment with the best methods of surviving the level. The game is very free-flowing, and with practice you can pull off some incredibly skillful manoeuvres to best navigate the levels. For an arcade-based game, there are of course the legacy of boss battles. These are the only times when the auto-scrolling stops and you are somewhat free to take down the enemy. Level 1's dragon is really epic for such an early point in the game, and helps set the tone that the game is going to get much larger in scale. Atomic Runner is not a game that everyone will find easy to pick up. As mentioned earlier, the control system is something that you will need to get used to. As you can't walk to the left, there will be times that you shoot down a power-up but are unable to go back and pick it up. Unlike most run and gun games, this asks the player to think and plan their wave of destruction through the level. A simple rush strategy is unlikely to provide the best results. Add into this the complexity of the button and pad control system, you can jump, fire, and turn Chelnov to face either left or right. It's this choosing left or right direction that takes the getting used to. When you pick this one up, you would think that the left on the joypad would face you to the left, but it doesn't. Left means stand still. Instead, there's a specific button to face the opposite direction. However, the game menu does include several options here, so it's worth finding a method that works for you. The game is undeniably addictive. Choosing a direction to face, whether to jump on an enemy or shoot, as well as knowing the most appropriate weapon, all builds to a fascinating experience. As mentioned at the top of the episode, Atomic Runner really does outclass the arcade original. Side by side, the Sega Home editions just look crisper, more detailed, and even have extra content. For a physical release, Atomic Runner also stands up reasonably well. The artwork is really well conceived, and even if you didn't know what the game was about, it's exciting enough for you to at least look at the front cover and explore this one further. The main design of course makes it onto the game cartridge and manual, as was the style of Mega Drive games of the day. I've spoken a bit around the original Chelnov arcade release and how likely it was to offend, or at least be considered inappropriate, particularly at the time of its release. And I'm sure that a lot of you are thinking, surely Chelnov is not unique in referencing the Chernobyl disaster, and you'd be right. 2007's Stalker, Shadow of Chernobyl, and of course the Call of Duty games both make reference to the events of the disaster, as do many other games. You only have to type Chernobyl movies into Google to also see how many horror movies also reference the events. What sets Chelnov apart though, was the timing of the game. It's important to remember that the context that in 1988 people were still dying of radiation-related sicknesses caused by the event. This wasn't some archive footage of a bleak past, this was happening now. Now I have to say I'm not personally a big fan of censorship in games. My preference is to be given the information and I'll make my own mind up whether I agree or disagree on the content. It's for that reason I'd like to think that I wouldn't have played Chelnov in the arcade back in the day, but have no issues with those that did. After all, if you missed the attract screen or the very short title screen, chances are you wouldn't actually know what this referred to in the first place. No matter how grim the origins are, at the end of the day we have to remember it is just a game. When you look at other media, such as Radioactive Man from The Simpsons, and the direct link to the Soviet era in his backstory, it's also very clear that the events of Chernobyl likely influenced his creation too. It's just executed in a much more generic way. It doesn't dodge the question of superhero origin stories via a nuclear disaster, it just doesn't sensationalise real-life events. On paper, you would have to say that Atomic Runner is a game that was unlikely to ever happen. Based on a game, based on a real-life Soviet-era tragedy, is one of the more unusual origins for a game, and in theory has no right to exist, let alone be a classic retro game. What Sega did here was to make a reasonably brave decision. Their belief in the game concept itself was enough to resurrect this title. Moving the action to a more modern setting, complete reworks of level designs, elimination of the Soviet theme and reference to the Chernobyl disaster all paid off to create a great home gaming experience. Atomic Runner may not be a game particularly well known to the younger crowd of today, but you're almost certain to still find Chelnov on controversial video game top 10 lists. However, take away the controversy as Sega did and you might just find one of the most addictive retro games you've played in years. Hello again, I hope you enjoyed today's show and thank you for the view. Remember, you can always comment, like, subscribe and find us on the social media sites below. Happy collecting!